Hello, Politicats. Hello, the world. Hello, the internet. Hello to Jason Isaacs at the back there. A lot of people ask, why do I say hello to Jason Isaacs? And who is Jason Isaacs? Well, to answer those questions in reverse order, Jason Isaacs is an actor, and I say hello to him for reasons that are best explained at Friday afternoon on Radio 5 Live, but I'll let you investigate that. Okay, so we're here. We're going to talk about the executive, and it's a very big topic, and as a result of that, I've had to bring in my assistant. This is Poppy, and Poppy, the political dachshund, and she's going to presumably help or run away at some point during the recording as appropriate. Also, the chances of me getting this into one 15-minute slot are pretty minimal. But we'll see what we do, and we will come out the other end, hopefully a little bit older and a whole lot wiser. So, the executive, a huge topic, probably 2 videos. Let's see where we finish. Okay, we talk about the executive, we talk about government, we talk about cabinet. These words can be very confusing because they tend to get chucked around fairly indiscriminately, and this can be fairly confusing. When I'm talking about the government in the context of this particular presentation, I'm not talking about the legislature. The legislature obviously is something entirely different. That's the legislature that legislates. We're looking at the executive. We're looking at what we would call in the United Kingdom the government or the executive, and that's split into 2 particular sections. We've got the permanent and we've got the political. Now, at this point, I should stop and backtrack a little bit. We're going to go into this in much, much more detail than you could ever need for the purposes of answering a specific exam question. It's very unlikely that you're going to get questioned on the permanent executive, for instance. However, it is on the curriculum, and you do need to know it if you want to know how the whole of the executive works. And so I'm going to do a really, really deep dive into this, and hopefully come out the other side, with an understanding of the workings of the executive, particularly the political executive. And within the political executive, of course, we've got the cabinet, and then within the cabinet, we have our beloved Prime Minister. So the focus of any exam question is going to be this bit over here, but in order to answer that, you need to know how all of these things work. This is all in the curriculum. You need to know all of this. They're all contained. If they're not described in this particular presentation, they'll be described in other presentations. I know I've got different models of the royal prerogative, and I've got different executive models that's explained elsewhere. All of this you need to know, even if in the new post-Gove environment, you're not going to get a 15-mark question on one of these or one of these or one of those or one of those. You're not going to get a 15-mark question on these anymore. But if you're going to understand how the executive works, and presumably you're here because you want to know how the executive works, then you need to know how all of these things work. So here's the things you need to know today. First of all, what does the executive do? Well, the executive makes decisions. That is what it means to be an executive. If you are an executive, your job is to make decisions. Jeff Bezos, you may know, chief executive of Amazon, he was once asked about this, and they said, well, how many decisions do you make in a day? You get paid millions of dollars. How many decisions do you make? And he said, well, I make maybe 3 or 4 in a day or in a week. And he said, well, that's not very many. He said, no, it's not, but I need to make sure that I get them right. So it's not about necessarily the number of decisions that you're making, more the fact that you have to get the answers absolutely right. In the context of Amazon, maybe Jeff Bezos answers 4 or 5 questions a day. In the case of government, you've got to answer many, many more than that. But obviously, government is a much bigger entity than Jeff Bezos. And let's move on, because I think I've beaten that analogy way past breaking point. So what does the executive do? It makes decisions. What you need to know is, where in the executive are those decisions made? Now, that might seem a ridiculous question, but as I'll go on to explain, it's pretty straightforward, but it's also very, very important. And then you need to know how those particular decisions impact the wider political scene. So how do those decisions affect the legislature? How do those decisions affect the judiciary? And the way in which they do is because basically those decisions decide public policy. What are we going to do today? What should be the priority of this particular government, and what should be the priority of the operations of the state at this point? Having made that decision, the job of the executive in this country certainly is to nurse that policy decision through the legislative process to the point where it becomes a law. Because, of course, we all know that two things. First of all, only Parliament can make law. And secondly, to be legitimate in the context of parliamentary government, the government has to operate through Parliament. So only through law can the government work, and only Parliament can make law. And so the job of the executive is to nurse legislation through, nurse that policy through the legislative process from a bill to a law, so it can then become, it can then come into force. And again, that's the last point of the job of the executive, taking that legislation and making it work, and then running the country through the exercise of law. Okay, so that's what you need to know. How does all of that work? Well, it works like this. This is quite an old document. This is what the government, what newspapers were doing pre-Brexit when they had nothing else to talk about. Oh, those halcyon days. So this is what it means to run Britain. These are all the different areas that the government has to control. And we can look at it through another visualization, and you can see the date on this straight away. This was 2011, 2012. And look at that enormous number. So this is what it costs to run Albion PLC. And you can see here where all the money goes. I'm not going to go into this in great detail, not least because these figures are 7 or 8 years out of date. But that's an idea. You can pause, have a look at that, and if I remember, I will link off to that so link off to numbers. Okay, there we go. I'll remember that one now. Here's another representation of this. This is where all the money goes. Again, you can pause that and have a look at it. And here's some more up-to-date. Well, here's a sense of how that's grown over time. And here's some more up-to-date numbers from another very, very good website. And you can see the address up there. So, yeah, go and check them out. I'll link off to that in the comments section. So, as mentioned earlier, we know all about parliamentary government, the key idea here being derived legitimacy. That becomes very, very important later, so do remember that. The specific terms of that is that government is chosen from Parliament. All members of government must either be members of the House of Lords or the House of Commons. They should be accountable to Parliament. We have our select committees, ministerial questions, and all of that sort of stuff. And of course, they must operate through Parliament. There we have the exercise of law. So, mentioned this earlier, the political executive and the permanent executive. The political executive, these are the ones that we know about, okay? These are the government ministers. These are career politicians, so they are not experts in any particular field. That is massively important. Their expertise is being a politician, not knowing how education works or how defense works or even how transport works. Their job is basically running elections or winning elections and representing constituents. And then they're plucked from the House of Commons or indeed the House of Lords and then dropped into government where they act as ministers. But they are not experts, and that is very, very important. As they are political appointments, they will change from time to time, both in terms of individuals and indeed in the role that they're doing. The government will have a clear out every time we have a change of party, and every time we have a change of government every time the House of Commons changes hands, obviously we'll have a complete clear out at the top. But from time to time there will be changes within government as ministers either resign or get fired, or the Prime Minister generally gets bored and he will do something like reshuffle his cabinet. So their role then is to make decisions regarding, well, you can read that. So they're there to make decisions and then to run their departments. The permanent executive, now this is very different. This is the civil service. These are career bureaucrats, so they are experts. They know what they're talking about. They know how to run education. They know how to run transport. They know how to run defense. So when your career politician comes in, on top of that, he has a layer of expertise that he can call upon to help him make decisions to make sure he doesn't mess things up too badly. We know this because they don't change. If there's an election, all of this lot will get cleared out, but these guys remain in situ. Excuse me. So the new politicians coming in have got a layer of expertise and experience upon which they can call. They don't change after the election. They're neutral, so they're not supposed to give political advice. They're there to give advice about statecraft, and everyone wants to do a deep dive into that. I don't really have the time or the crayons to explain that right now. But they do not give political advice. The advice that the civil service should be giving is about what's best for the country, not best for a particular politician and his career. And they are anonymous. Now, again, we know their names. You can look them all up on the internet, and we do that in a little bit. But the key point here is they're anonymous in the sense that if something goes wrong, you don't throw your civil servant under the bus, okay? The civil servants are there to give advice and to explain. If on the basis of that your career politician makes a bad call, then it's not the fault of the civil servant, okay? The civil servant is there to offer advice, and the political executive will act off the top of that advice. It's their job to exercise judgment, decide whether that advice is sound or not. You do not throw your civil servant under the bus. And again, we can come up, sorry, it's frog in my throat this morning, to find examples of that and see how that works in the real world. You're not going to be discussing this really in an essay, but you need to understand how this works if you're going to understand how the executive fulfills its role, where those decisions are made, and how those decisions affect the wider political sphere. So, there you go. Their role is to advise the political executive. Again, most of you will be able to read, so I don't need to read that one out for you. Although it does go on to say implementation behind my little screencast there. So, just to sort of represent that in a silly little animation or sketch here. So, 2008, Blair resigned. Well, Blair resigned in 2007. Gordon Brown came in 2008, and this was his election. He came in, and there was this ready-made layer of political expertise underneath him, or statecraft expertise underneath him, to help him make the right decisions. They obviously last until 2010. We got a new lot in, and that lot came in. They knew nothing about anything, but fortunately they had this sort of ballast, this foundational layer of political understanding who were there to help them in trying to run the country. They lasted until 2015, and then in came this lot. Again, some layer of expertise there, but more critically, they could rely upon this ballast, this sort of political ballast, who would help them make their decisions and run the country. Let's have a look at how that works in a particular instance here. So they give advice, that policy goes back to them, and then that is turned into legislation. So let's put it this way. Let's assume that Cameron, although actually this was the coalition really that we're looking at here. So the coalition said, right, we want to improve the provision of health and social care. How do we do that? Okay, said the civil service, well, you do it like this. We will draft you legislation, and this will help you to improve health and social care. Thank you very much, says the government. So they take that draft legislation from the civil servants. They then take it to Parliament. Parliament takes that and then works upon it. In the case of the Health and Social Care Bill, you'll remember it was heavily amended in the House of Lords, and then returned to the government in the form of legislation. This legislation is then passed back to the civil service, and they're told, right, here we have our Health and Social Care Act. You guys need to go out and make sure that this is how it's going to work. So, yeah, just get on and do it. And they did. So we have advice going in that direction, policy going in that direction, bills going from there to there, and then on to the House of Commons and the House of Lords, and then the legislation comes back and then goes back like that. And that's largely how the government interacts between the political and the permanent civil service. Having said all of that, this is what it looks like, or what it looked like in 2016. You might want to go and check on these numbers because they have changed since then. Go and look at government.co.uk. I'll send you a link to that at the bottom as well. This is what the government looks like in 2016. There's an obvious addition to there. See if you can work that one out. That is no longer 21, it's higher. See if you can work out why. And this is what it looked like in 2016. My God, if a week is a long time in politics and a year is even longer, this is what government looks like when I'm recording this particular presentation. Goodness knows what it's going to look like 6 months down the line. Goodness knows what it's going to look like when you're sitting your exam. But I'm going to leave it at that because we are just about out of time on this 15-minute video. You should take a copy of that. Make sure you know who's in charge of all of those, plus the new mystery department, which is going to sit off there. You'll work out what that one is, and I'll see you back for the next half of this presentation in a little while. See you soon. Whoa. That wasn't a very dramatic exit, was it, Poppy?